Okay, in this episode, we journey back to 1750. And as you can see the map here, the British, French, and Spanish claims, as well as the Russians up near Alaska. And what we'll be doing here is setting the stage for what we'll be focusing on, for the most part, the French Indian War. Looking at the British colonies at this time, a couple things that kind of characterize them is that they, have developed kind of their own colonial assemblies, and kind of the belief of their own constitutions, written documents that kind of have grown in strength as colonial assemblies have continued to gather more strength and pass more laws, and regulate, what's going on within their own colonies more as time has gone on. We also notice that the electorate is quite high. There's a lot of people that can vote because there's a lot of people that own land. And actually, in Massachusetts, it's believed that maybe 95% of the males could actually vote. Other things that we see are that people are more well informed by journals of the day that would share information, and that colonial governors, had powers that would be kind of similar to the kings and back in England, and sometimes even had powers that the king didn't have. And over time, as the colonial population continued to increase, and as settlers continue to kind of move westward, we see one of our enlightened thinkers, Benjamin Franklin, propose what becomes known as the Albany Plan. And actually, his join or die political cartoon is probably one of the first political cartoons in colonial history. And basically, what he was proposing with the Albany Plan was this intercolonial kind of council where different colonies could send representatives to discuss relations with natives, and kind of the way that Franklin envisioned this grand council being able to, tax, help regulate trade, provide for defense and plans for expansion. But even though this might have helped the settlers and kind of kept things, running a little bit smoother, eventually the crown turns it down as they fear that this may take away some of the king's power. But not only did the king dislike it, colonial assemblies did as well. Because like I had mentioned, as they had gained in strength through time, they thought if there was this grand council, then perhaps they would lose some of their own power within their own colonies. So this Albany Plan, even though it maybe had a little support at the beginning, never does take hold. But it was the first kind of really attempt, or kind of mentioning of kind of unifying all the colonies under one council. And that brings us to the French and Indian War. This war takes place from 1754 to 1763, and it is really a struggle for supremacy between the French and the British, as both sides competed to colonize the Ohio River Valley, as they kind of looked west of the Appalachian Mountains, and they saw the economic potential and the plethora of fur trading opportunity. And this really becomes also the beginning of hostilities, not only between the French and the British, but also between the colonies and Great Britain as well, as they kind of start to see some of their differences, even though they fight with each other in this war. And as I said, it does begin in the Ohio River Valley in 1754, as the roughly 21 or 22-year-old Washington, with 160 men, marches towards Fort Duquesne, which is near present-day Pittsburgh. And Washington attempts to oust the French by force from this region. And he is able to surprise some of the scouts of the French and Indians and defeat them. And once he does that, he gives orders to build Fort Necessity, anticipating a French counterattack. And eventually that attack does come, and Washington and his men are taken captive, and eventually released. But for nearly 2 years, the French then controlled this region before General Edward Braddock plans to try to go in, oust the French, But the problem for him wasn't how to fight the enemy. The problem was how to get to the enemy, as this region is heavily wooded. It's tough to traverse, and eventually in 1755, as his forces are marching on Fort Duquesne once again, he had about 2,500 British troops versus about 1,500 French troops. But the French ambush him, and the British end up suffering nearly 70% casualty rate. And even General Braddock himself is eventually injured and dies from his wounds. And while the French are winning in the Ohio Valley, they are having tougher times elsewhere. And eventually in 1757, William Pitt becomes foreign minister of England. And after disastrous defeats in the Ohio River Valley, Pitt reformulated the British strategy to attack the French from Canada. He also effectively managed the war supplies, coordinated the accumulation of material and men, and even planned a compromise with the colonists to try to help get more of their support. To get their loyalty and military cooperation, Britain promised to reimburse colonial assemblies for their costs in attempting to help the British against their French and Indian counterparts. And through Pitt's reorganization and way of running things, by 1758, things start to turn in favor for the English. And in fact, 1758, the British captured Lake Ontario. When Fort Frontenac surrendered, that basically cut off communication between the Ohio River Valley and Montreal, one of the strong points of the French. But also by taking Louisburg up in the northeast there, the British are basically able to cut off the French supply line, as that was kind of the entry point down the St. Lawrence River to the Great Lakes. And also in 1759, when a siege lasting nearly 2 months ultimately ended with the British capturing Quebec. So 58 and 59 really was some key time here for the English kind of closing in on the French to help drive them out of their colonial empire here in North America. And eventually, as the English continue to have more success, by 1763, when the French and Indian War ends, we see the map of North America has changed a little bit with the ousting of the French and the British basically getting a lot of their land, and the Spanish kind of taking over the Louisiana territory, but also giving Florida to the British, as the Spanish had joined in with the French for a little bit themselves. And hopefully this map just kind of gives you a little comparison of, kind of before the war and post-war boundaries as well. And as you can see, some of the effects of the French Indian War on Britain, as Britain was able to increase her colonial empire, as the French, as I mentioned, were expelled basically from North America. But at the same time, they ran up a large debt, and it was this debt that led to an escalation of tensions, which will eventually lead up to the Revolutionary War. And then also some bitter feelings had formed as the Americans kind of actually start calling themselves Americans, and they kind of start to see that they're a little bit different than the British. And where the British kind of look at the Americans as cowards and didn't fight well or take orders well, and they kind of snub their noses at the colonists kind of looked at the British as kind of, with contempt, and didn't like the way that they were being treated. But it's ironically Britain winning the French and Indian War and the war for empire that ultimately leads to its losing its empire, as the seeds for colonial conflict will eventually lead to the Revolutionary War itself. And for the colonists, you can see that it not only united them against a common enemy, the French and the Indians, but it did create a socializing experience, meaning that colonists from different colonies came in contact with each other, were able to communicate with each other, were able to see that they had similarities with each other. And then this eventually leads to kind of the more united feeling, especially after the British started to tax them more and pass other acts which restricted their freedom to move west of the Appalachians. As England, after this war, felt that it was needed a major reorganization of her American empire to try to ensure that stability and safety continued to exist. As even though the French had been expelled from the area, there were obviously still natives that were potential conflict. But it's these new laws and taxes which will eventually kind of light the fire, and it won't sit well with the colonists, that eventually leads to the American Revolutionary War. And we'll see that obviously over time the colonists get tired with these new rules and regulations, and eventually do fight back.